All right. Okay. So now let's get started. Thank you, Willow, for making it here. So as I've been advertising to people, this is actually a replacement for the talk that you were actually supposed to give at the JSM as part of the student paper competition finalist talks in that session. But instead, because I couldn't make it at the last moment, we decided that we'll have it at a different time. And I figured that something like a CHASC meeting is probably a very good venue for two reasons. One is that it'll give you a lot of time to present the work because our format is very is fairly informal. For those people who are newish on this list, you're welcome to interrupt and ask questions at any time. The reason being that this is a cross-disciplinary audience, and everyone would prefer there be clarifications as soon as doubts arise. So with that, I take it away, Willow. See if you can go ahead and start.
Fantastic. Okay, here we go. Okay, let me just move this around and move some of the Zoom things around. Okay. All right, fantastic. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Willow, and today I'm going to be talking to you about reducing ground-based astrometric errors with Gaia and Gaussian processes. And I'll explain all about what that means over the next little while. This is a paper that I did, the paper that I co-wrote with my PI, Dr. Gary Bernstein at the University of Pennsylvania when I was a senior undergraduate there for my honors thesis project. Now I'm at the University of Delaware. You can see the finally published paper here at AppJ, or at the Astronomical Journal. And you can also see similar work by Leggett et al., which was done on the hypersuprime cam, if you're interested. So, okay, let's get started. Bam, okay. All right, so this is a picture of the instrument that was used to collect all of the data that I used in this paper. And what I did in this paper, what we did in this paper, was try to improve astrometric measurements in the dark energy survey. And so first of all, what is astrometry? Astrometry is the study of stellar positions. So astro meaning star and metry meaning measure. Astrometry, the goal of astrometry, or precision astrometry, is to measure stellar positions as accurately as possible. And so that's exactly what we were trying to do. And specifically, we're trying to develop a machine learning method using a space-based observatory called Gaia in conjunction with a ground-based observatory. In this case, this was the Victor M. Blanco telescope, using these two in a machine learning model to try to improve the astrometric accuracy of the ground-based instrument. And so here we go. First of all, another really amazing picture of the Victor M. Blanco telescope. This is it under construction, the site under construction. You can see the 4-meter diameter primary mirror in the background here. And essentially what would happen is that light comes in from the left and bounces off the primary mirror, and then it gets directed right into this object, which is the camera. So this is just, well, it's not at all like, but it is just a camera in the same way that there's a camera in your phone. And here is a better view of the camera. So you can see the light comes in from the window here and bounces into the camera. And this camera is quite large, as you can tell. And the reason why it needs to be so large is many reasons. But first of all, we want to take high resolution images. And so you can see here, this is a few pictures of what we call the focal plane of the camera. And by the way, this camera is called the dark energy camera, and I'll explain why in a moment. But you can see here on the right that each of these rectangular tiles is what the actual imaging sensor is. So if you were to take apart your phone, you wouldn't find this particular type of imaging sensor in your phone, but you would find an imaging sensor in your phone that is not too dissimilar to this. Except as you can see, this is human-sized, or perhaps dog-sized, or maybe a very small horse-sized. And what this is doing is this is just capturing the light as it enters the camera and actually taking the image. And you can see this is the actual pattern that it creates. You can see that in this particular camera, we have this hexagonal shape. And so if you ever see an image that is shaped like this in the wild, you'll know that it's taken from the dark energy camera. Okay. Now, the dark energy survey and the dark energy camera, just some overviews here. Again, this dark energy survey, which I'll explain momentarily. This is hosted at the Victor M. Blanco telescope at the Cerro Tololo Inter-American Observatory, the CTIO. This is a ridgeline in Chile where this observatory and other observatories are located. They take beautiful images like you see on the right of NGC 1365, which is 60 million light years away. It takes fantastic images. The dark energy camera, which is the actual instrument that takes the pictures, this, I believe, if I have my history right, this was donated or given, not donated, but given to the CTIO in exchange for observation time. So in exchange for using their telescope for this dark energy survey, which again, I'll explain soon, they gave this state-of-the-art camera to improve this aging telescope. This camera is comprised of 62 CCD tiles. CCD is a type of imaging sensor. You might be familiar with the CMOS sensor inside your phone. And these tiles are 2048 by 4096 pixels each, generating a grand total for each image of 520 megapixels. For reference, the iPhone 12 Pro has a 12 megapixels camera. So, you do the math there. That's quite a lot of iPhone 12 Pros. Now, what the dark energy survey actually is, we call it it's a 5,000 square degree survey over 6 years. So what we're doing here is we're systematically imaging the sky, in particular the southern sky, right? Because this is in Chile. We're systematically imaging the sky over 6 years. And not just any portion of the sky, but a specific area of the sky, which is about 5,000 square degrees in angular area. To give a reference, I believe the moon is about half a degree in diameter. That might be wrong. But anyway, this is a very large region of the sky that the dark energy survey is covering. And it was done, it's completed now. It was done over 758 nights over 6 years. And the main goals of the dark energy survey, which I'll now just refer to as DES, the main goals of DES was looking for evidence of dark energy and dark matter, and of course, lots of other things. If you're not familiar with dark energy, dark matter, it doesn't matter because the work that I'm doing here has nothing to do with that. So don't worry.
Good question.
Okay.
Willow?
Yeah, for sure.
So what was the field of view of the 62 tiles that are in each snapshot?
I don't know the field of view of each tile specifically, but the field of view of the camera and the instrument in total is about 2 degrees across.
2 degrees across, okay. And there are how exactly is distortion or astigmatism or any of those things dealt with, or is that not a concern?
Well, sorry, what was the question?
How are optical imperfections dealt with in the pipeline? I mean, do you treat all tiles to be identical, or each of them, or things in the extreme dealt with differently? Right.
So I'm not an expert on this, but this is essentially what you're getting at here is essentially the precursor to the work that I'm doing. So all of the systematic imperfections in the CCD tiles were handled before I even got to the data. To answer your question, were they dealt on a tile by tile basis? I believe that they were. All of the different CCD imperfections were measured using star flat images. So images of long exposure images of the sky, I believe, or dark images.
No, I was actually asking about the figure of the telescope, the focal plane, any distortions that in the point spread function that you might see between on axis versus at the edges, or they part that did this at all.
Right. So no. So the work that I've done doesn't address that at all.
Okay.
Okay. Cool. Okay. So Oh, was that up? Okay. So now let me shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk about a different observatory. This is the Reuben Observatory, or the Vera C. Reuben Observatory, which is currently under construction and kind of awaiting first light, where first light is the first time that the telescope is looking at stars. And this is also at the Cerro Inter-American Observatory at the, it might not be at the exact same site, but it's nearby to the Victor M. Blanco telescope. Excuse me. And this is sort of the next generation survey telescope that is being built now and has similar science goals to the dark energy survey. Here is an image of the focal plane of the Vera C. Reuben's telescope. You might be able to tell that it's much larger. In fact, this is a 3.2 gigapixel array. So what is that? It's about six times as many pixels as the dark energy camera. This was built at Stanford, I believe. A really amazing instrument. Here is the full camera. You might be able to tell that this is much larger than the dark energy camera. Everybody at the Reuben says that this camera is about the size of a small car or a European car, quite large. Okay, and here is a cool image that I took when I was at the Richard F. Karras Mirror Lab in the University of Arizona. This is the kiln that is used to actually melt down and form the mirrors that's going to be used for the Reuben Observatory. And I would encourage you, it's not strictly related to this talk, but I would encourage you to ask me questions about how they make the mirrors for Reuben and for the other telescopes. It's really fascinating. But okay, enough of that. A little bit overview of the Vera C. Reuben Observatory and this additional survey, which I'm introducing to you, called the Legacy Survey for Space and Time, or LSST. Again, this is near CTIO. It's kind of the successor to the Dark Energy Survey. The total area on the sky covered is about 18,000 square degrees, as opposed to the 5,000 for the Dark Energy Survey. And again, this is a systematic imaging of the sky across, in this case, 10 years. And this is, as I said, a 3.2 gigapixel camera. And again, the goal is to investigate dark energy and dark matter, but of course it's going to build, just like the Dark Energy Survey did, it's going to build an astrometric catalog. It's going to build a catalog of millions and billions of objects in the sky and their astrometric positions on the sky. And so that's what we're interested in. And so now let me talk about the problem that we're trying to solve in this work. And the problem is initiated by atmospheric turbulence. So what I can show you here, if I can orient yourselves, you can imagine that if this image is, you can imagine that you're standing on the southern tip of the South American continent, to try to orient yourself to where the Dark Energy Survey took place. What's happening here is that we'll have laminar stable airflow, air currents, moving across the continent from the ocean. And when you take a picture through laminar stable airflow, as you see at site A, you'll get a picture of Jupiter, for example, like on the left. You'll get a very clear, crisp image that looks like Jupiter. But what happens is that these air currents in the lower atmosphere pass over landmass. The air becomes turbulent. There's lots of vortices. Suddenly, the air is doing very complicated things. And looking through that atmosphere, for reasons that I'll get into later, looking through that atmosphere causes your image to be of poorer quality. So you can see here that the image is blurry. And what this means is that when we're looking at stars, which are point objects in the sky, when we're looking at these stars, we're going to measure their positions incorrectly. So it's obviously not going to be blurry because we can't resolve the star itself, but the position that we measure of the star is going to be wrong because of this turbulent flow. And this turbulent flow is going to differ by the hour, by the minute, and of course by the day. So it's not always, a lot of thought goes into choosing the observing sites for these telescopes, but still there's going to be turbulence in the atmosphere that you have to deal with. And so the point of this work, the point of the work that we did, is to try to develop a machine learning method using some true positions of the stars, which I'll get to soon, if we can find some true positions of the stars somehow, then we can use some regression techniques to interpolate the true positions as measured from the ground, okay, through this turbulent atmosphere. And so that's what we're going to get into now. And the way that we do that, one way to get above the atmosphere is, of course, to literally get above the atmosphere using a space-based observatory. So this is Gaia. This is a European Space Agency satellite. And this is a wonderful satellite, which is doing an all-sky astrometric map, among other things. It's taking beautiful images like this. You can see the Milky Way here, as well as the large and small Magellanic Clouds. And what it's doing is it's measuring, it's imaging the sky and measuring the positions very, very accurately of billions of objects on the sky. And the point is that this telescope, this space-based telescope, can get very, very accurate measurements of the stellar positions because it doesn't have the atmosphere to contend with. The downside, of course, is that sending things into space is extremely expensive. And so the telescope size, or the primary mirror size for Gaia, is going to be much smaller. So Gaia has 2 of these mirrors in it, and these are much, much smaller than the 4-meter diameter telescope in the Blanco telescope. And I didn't tell you, but the Reuben Observatory is going to have an 8-meter primary mirror. And so we can see that here with this wonderful image comparing different telescope sizes. I hope you can see my mouse. I think you can. Here is what was the Reuben, here is the Reuben Observatory's primary mirror. It used to be called the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. Here's the Reuben Observatory 8-meter primary mirror. Here's Hubble, which is a 2-meter mirror. So you can imagine what a 4-meter mirror would look like. And here is Gaia, the 2 rectangularly shaped mirrors. And so what this means is it has a much smaller collecting area of light than does Reuben Observatory or even the Blanco telescope. And what this means is that it's not going to be able to see objects which are quite so faint. So the faintest thing that Gaia can see is very bright compared to the faintest thing that Reuben will be able to see, or what even the Blanco telescope can see. And so this is where we believe we can, fill a niche in a sense. So let me talk about the method, the actual method now that I've given you some introduction and background. Let's talk about what we actually did. And I'll explain this image on the right as we go. So what we're doing is we're registering the Y6 DES catalog to the Gaia DR2 catalog. And now let me, of course, take a step back and explain what that means. What we're doing here is we're saying, okay, Gaia measures stellar positions extremely accurately, okay, much better than what the DES can measure, much better than what's in the DES catalog. But the Gaia can only see, the DES survey, the dark energy survey, has objects that are much fainter in it. So the idea is that we use the stars that both Gaia and the DES can see, and we match those 2 catalogs together. So that's what I mean by registering. And then Y6 DES means the full 6 years of the dark energy survey catalog. And then Gaia DR2 stands for Gaia Data Release 2, which was the most up-to-date data release at the time. And so what we're doing is we're matching these 2 catalogs together for the stars that both Gaia and the DES can see. All right, that's the first step. And the next thing is we're constructing the residual field of positions. And so that's exactly what we see on the right here. So each of these points, this is a simplified explanation of this plot, but each of these vectors is pointing from a star measured by the DES, and it's pointing to a star measured by Gaia. Okay, and so essentially you can think of this plot as sort of a truth map in a sense, because we're kind of assuming that the Gaia measurements represent the true stellar positions. Of course, there is still some inaccuracy in the Gaia measurements, but they're much smaller than what's in the DES measurements. You can think of this residual field as a sort of a truth map. We're pointing from the ground-based observations to the space-based observations. Okay, so that's the first step in our method here. And the next thing that we're doing is we're training a Gaussian.
Yes. Yeah. So this is on the celestial plane. I mean, this is For instance, the center is pointing towards the galactic center. Is that
right? So this image is actually just this is for one particular exposure. I don't know where the camera was pointing at the time, but this is for one particular exposure where the center here is simply the center of the image that was taken.
okay? And this flow pattern could change from observation to observation, or is it
Right?
fixed?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
So right. So what this flow pattern is showing here, if we assume that all of the systematic effects in the camera in the focal plane were removed, which we do assume that. If we assume that, then what this pattern here is telling us, it's telling us about the atmospheric distortion at the moment that this particular image was taken. Okay, so you might be able to convince yourself here that, each of these vectors, they kind of know about each other. When, this vector pointing in this direction kind of is pointing in the same direction as its neighbor. And so what we're saying is that this residual field is highly correlated. And specifically, we're saying that this correlation is due to the atmospheric turbulent effects at the time that this picture was taken. And so you might be wondering, is there something we can say in general across multiple days or certain times of the day? Is there something we can say about the atmospheric turbulence to inform this model? And as far as we're concerned, the answer is no. This residual field, this distortion field, is inherently random and changes, minute by minute. And so there's nothing we can say about it that could help inform us, except for the general process by which it's created. And so that's what we're doing here. So with this Gaussian process regression model, we're minimizing this correlated variance. So we're minimizing this correlation in the field using this custom kernel that we'll talk about, which is based off of known atmospheric physics. Okay, and then finally, we're going to calculate the reduction in correlated variance, and I'll show you graphs of the correlation function and such before and after the application of this method. Let me just take a sip of water. Yeah.
So it would in part depend on how the original positions were estimated. So can you comment on how the positions that set the base of the green vectors on this plot were calculated? Is it some pipeline that was common to the dark energy survey or something like that? Like, how is the PSF modeled and how are these solutions found?
Right. So all so the DES measurements are all. So what happens is an image of the sky is taken. You're exactly right. Some data pipeline is employed here. The particular method for extracting the stellar positions is called source extractor. That's what was used. So I'm not intimately familiar with how source extractor works, but this program called source extractor extracts from an image of the sky. It extracts the different stellar sources and provides variances and positions. And so the data that I see is essentially just a list of positions on the sky along with errors. Okay. All right, so now I'll get into a little bit of Gaussian process regression.
Willow,
Sure.
There's a question in the chat, which asks, what is the kernel that you used?
Yes, so the kernel, I'll get into that very shortly. The kernel is the whole heart of this, and so I'll spend a lot of time on that.
Sure, thanks.
Okay, so Gaussian process regression. I'll just a brief overview for people who aren't so familiar with it. A Gaussian process is simply, this is the definition that everybody uses. It's a collection of random variables, any finite number of which has a joint Gaussian distribution. And this can be thought of as a distribution over functions. So you can imagine that some function f of x is distributed according to GP, a Gaussian process, and this accepts this Gaussian process is distributed according to some mean function m of x and some kernel function k x of x prime. This kernel function also has some parameters associated with it, and the exact form of the kernel function is, of course, open to the machine learning person who, it's open to me, it's open to my discretion and what we think is the best model this is what's actually modeling the covariance of this residual field, essentially. Okay, and so again, so here, before I get into more about what the kernel is, let me just take a step back and explain again what exactly we're doing here. So our model inputs, this machine learning, this regression model inputs are the DES astrometric positions, and then the targets are going to be the residuals between the DES measurements and the Gaia measurements. Okay, so that's what we're asking this model to predict. And then finally, with the heart of the model is the kernel, which is dependent upon some parameters theta. And this is essentially, I think I'm going to skip over this, but essentially the upshot here, if you're not familiar with Gaussian process regression, is that it's very simple linear algebra, except there is a matrix inversion that we have to do that makes this process incredibly slow. It's been a while since I've been doing this, but I believe matrix inversion is an n-cubed operation. And so this is a really slow process actually calculating the Gaussian process regression when you have lots of stars in your model. Okay, and you can also see that there these W matrices here. What this is saying is that we're also taking into account shot noise measurements from shot noise on the measurements in this model for both the Gaia stars and the DES stars. Okay, so talking a little bit about atmospheric turbulence again, with that same picture from before. Again, what we're saying here is that this residual pattern is essentially showing us what the atmosphere is doing at that moment. And so you can see some numbers above. So I'll explain. This says exposure 370609. That's just the index of the actual image that was taken. This says that there's 10,593 sources in this image, which is approximately 1 star per square arc minute. On this image, which is typical for images that are not in the galactic plane but are just off of the galactic plane. And you can see some RMS in the X and the Y direction, so that's in the up and down and horizontal directions, and then also the general estimate of the noise, which is quite small as well. And so if you're not familiar, a milliarc second, I'm not sure if everyone would be familiar with a milliarc second, but essentially we can separate each degree into 60 arc minutes, and then each arc minute into 60 arc seconds, and then a milliarc second is 1,000th of an arc second. So essentially, we're dealing with errors here on the scale of 1,000th of an arc second, so that's about like a millionth of a degree, just in general. Okay, so another thing that we notice here with this atmospheric turbulence is we notice that this turbulence is inherently anisotropic. And so what that means is that in one direction, which we'll call the major axis, we can see that in general, the turbulence errors are larger. And then along some minor axis, there is some minor axis where the errors are smaller. And how you can interpret this is you can say, okay, well, this is clearly across this particular exposure, the wind is blowing in a certain direction, and that is contributing towards errors being larger in one direction on the focal plane than in another. And what we can do is we can also measure the coherence length of this residual field, and it turns out to be about 10 arc minutes, which is to say that the approximate angular size on the focal plane where which the turbulence on the sky knows about each other is about 10 arc minutes. Okay, and so what we know about this atmospheric turbulence again is that the amplitude and the patterns, they change unpredictably, and we also know that this turbulence is anisotropic in both amplitude, which is what we're showing here in this picture, and also coherence length. So the coherence length is not the same for the major and minor axes either. Okay, but where Gaia fits into this is that Gaia has less than 1 milliarc second errors for these bright stars, for G less than 20 magnitude. And the Gaia survey has about 1 star per square arc minute. And so we think that this is good enough to be able to use in a machine learning model. Okay. Now, another point about this data is that we believe that it is curl-free. In fact, we believe that it's the gradient of some field, which I'll get into shortly. And what you can do is you can simply calculate the divergence and the curl of a typical exposure. This is a typical exposure. And what you see here is you see a streaky pattern of the divergence on the left. And you see basically noise on the right for the curl. And how we interpret this is essentially that this turbulence field is generated as the gradient of some function. And so what are we saying it's the gradient of? Well, you can imagine here in this beautiful image drawn by my PI, Dr. Gary Bernstein, as the wind is flowing across the camera, across the path of the image, we have the starlight coming in parallel rays. But as it crosses the turbulence, which has different index of refraction, okay, the starlight moves. The starlight changes its shape because it's passing through a medium with a different index of refraction. And so what we're saying is that the resulting position on the sky of this star through the atmosphere is going to be the gradient of this field phi. And what we're saying is that is the index of refraction integrated along the line of sight. Okay. And what we're saying is that this phi function is well approximated as a Gaussian random field with some power spectrum P of phi. And specifically, we're saying that Gaussian process interpolation, this Gaussian process regression method that we've chosen, it's going to be optimal for this problem if we choose the correct power spectrum, which is tantamount, which is the same as choosing the correct kernel function for this field. And so here is a description. Here is generally our model. Okay, so we're saying that if the turbulence is confined to a single layer in the atmosphere, which is clearly not correct, then we expect a power spectrum of index fluctuations following this model. So we have von Karman turbulence here, and this is the known atmospheric physics that I was talking about before. Von Karman turbulence is a popular way to model the power spectrum fluctuations of the atmosphere. We also insert a term here, which is an integration over the telescope aperture, which is why a Bessel function goes up, because the telescope aperture is circular. And so this J1 here is the Bessel function of the first kind. And then we also have the time integration of the wind motion. So this is essentially as these exposures are taken over about 30 seconds or 90 seconds maybe, and as the turbulence blows across the line of sight of the telescope, there's some time integration here, and so that's what we're including with this sinc squared function. And so as a result, we get 5 different parameters. We have some outer scale here, theta, which is essentially telling us about the size of the turbulence patch. We have the diameter, which is essentially the diameter of the telescope aperture at the height of the turbulence. We have this wind vector, which is the direction that the wind is blowing. This will be essentially the major axis that I was talking about before. And of course, this is 2 parameters, Wx and Wy. And then finally, we have the total variance, which is some amplitude for this power spectrum. And so what we can do is we can turn this power spectrum into a kernel function. And so that's how we get our kernel function. Okay, so what I'm showing you here now is I'm showing you the 2-dimensional 2-point correlation function of the residual field that I showed you before. So this isn't the exact same exposure as before, but it's from a similar exposure. I'm calculating the 2-dimensional 2-point correlation function, and that's in the top left here labeled raw. And so what you're seeing here in this image is that we have some major axis and we have some minor axis in our correlation function. And this is kind of what we would expect based off of what I was talking about before. And you can see there's some other structure here. There's lots of noise. What we do first of all, if I bring your attention to the bottom left now, what we're calling the fitted von Karman model. So what we're essentially doing is we're fitting before we perform any Gaussian process regression at all, to get an initial guess for the optimizer, what we're doing is we're fitting literally this image to our von Karman model. And this is what we get below. We get something that looks fairly similar, but not exactly quite right. You could interpret this in any way that you would like, that our model isn't exactly perfect. But this is the first step in approximating our correlation function. Okay, and the parameters that we get from this initial fitting before doing any Gaussian process regression, what we do is we then plug that as the initial guess into our black box optimizer that we use for actually doing the Gaussian process regression. And the reason that we do this, of course, is that it's extremely slow. So the matrix inversion that I was talking about means that performing this Gaussian process regression, doing one step of optimization takes about 2 to 3 minutes on 12 CPU cores, the cores that we're using at the University of Pennsylvania. And so 2 to 3 minutes for one, is insane. So typically this would take about 50 to 100 steps of optimization. So a couple hours for each exposure to optimize each exposure. But anyway, at the end of the optimization, the correlation function, the two-dimensional 2-point correlation function that we get looks like what you see on the right. And you might be thinking, that's insane. It's totally circular or almost totally circular and barely looks anything like what we see in the top left. And I would agree with you that that is strange. And I don't really have an answer for why that is, except to say that clearly, this model that we've chosen is not optimal. And finally, what we can do is yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just can you go back to the model and say how many free parameters are being fit during these optimization steps?
Yeah, so we have 5 parameters being fit. That's theta, d, the 2 components of the wind vector, and then the total variance.
Okay, and you're only minimizing the loss basically and reproducing the residual between stars that are cross-matched between Gaia and the DES survey. What fraction of your exposure is cross-matched? So based on you have some exposure, you find 10,000 sources. How many of those are cross-matched to Gaia that are included in the residual during the optimization?
Yeah, so in a typical DES exposure that I was looking at, there would be somewhere between 100,000 to 150,000 objects. 10,000 to 12,000 of those would be present in the Gaia, in the typical Gaia image. So that makes up our training and test set.
Okay, and so then you're inverting a 10,000 by 10,000 matrix at every step.
Right. Yeah, I think it'd be about 8,000 because we reserved that much for the test set. But yeah.
Okay.
And that brings up another point, actually. Specifically, what are we minimizing? The loss function that we're choosing is simply the actual the angle averaged two-dimensional 2-point correlation function. So if you were to average this in angle, average one of these images in angle, and just have a one-dimensional graph of the correlation function, so from at 0 separation out to some arbitrary amount of separation, then that's what we're minimizing, essentially the 0-point correlation function. And I'll explain that a little bit better shortly. Okay, so what we can do here is we can take the results of our optimized model. So we can use our optimized model. We can say, hello, I would like you to please predict on this new set of stars on our test set and tell us what the residual should be. And then we can subtract the residuals from the data, and we can calculate the two-dimensional 2-point correlation function and plot it again, and this is what you see. So what this is essentially saying is that we've basically removed the correlation in the data. This picture is always, continually surprising to me. If I were to lower the dynamic range, you would be able to see something in the middle here, and I'll show you that clearer later on. But still, this is, I don't know, it still impresses me that we're able to remove so much of the correlation with this method.
Question?
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
In that previous plot, say in the top left plot,
Mm-hmm.
Can you comment on why it's not symmetric? Because as far as I can see, this is just the how it should look for any given, there should be no angular information in there, right? So why is it, for example, tilted? I mean, is there something about the direction of the, the orientation of the, actually, I mean, yeah, why is there an orientation at all in the raw image?
Right. So what we as I understand it here, what's going on is that this angle that you're seeing is a result of the turbulence blowing across the exposure at an angle that is not perpendicular with up and down and left to right on the focal plane.
Okay. All right, makes sense. All right. So and this would, I mean, so this kind of orientation would change from image to image. It will look different for a different case.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. In that case, maybe it makes sense that the optimized von Karman model is circularly symmetric, because there really is not anything in the system that makes this orientation exist, except on an instantaneous image situation.
Well, these parameters are calculated for each exposure individually, not on a batch of exposures. Yeah. So we would initially expect this to look exactly like this. Yeah, so it's puzzling. It's puzzling for sure. And that's, of course, also why this takes so long. So there are, what is it, like 80,000 exposures in the DES catalog. It takes 2 to 3 hours to run one exposure to calculate, this model for one exposure. You're going to need a supercomputer for that sort of thing. Okay, so let me give you an overview of some of the non-standard Gaussian process regression aspects for this model. First of all, this is an anisotropic kernel. So essentially, one way to do this is you could just have one model that predicts on the X component of the residuals and one model that predicts on the Y component of the residuals to make this anisotropic. But that's not what we do, because we know from the slide that I showed you earlier about the divergence and curl, we know that the dimensions of the residuals here are not independent. So we expect this curl-free field, and X and Y data can inform each other. So we can incorporate that into the model to make just one model that predicts on both the X and the Y component of the residuals. And so what I say here, we derived a variant of the GPR formula, which enforces and exploits this by forming a single 2n by 2n covariance matrix for n points. And so that might be a little bit tricky to wrap your brain around, but essentially we're just compressing both of these models together. And what this allows us to do, it allows us for anisotropic measurement errors. So essentially we can have off diagonal components for measurement errors. We can incorporate those into the model, which you couldn't do otherwise if you were just predicting on X and Y separately. Okay, and just to point out, this isn't something that I planned on talking about, but just to point out, if you have an isotropic kernel, or if you have an anisotropic kernel where you're predicting on X and Y components of the residuals separately, that model does still work. So if you have a Gaussian process regressor for the X and the Y separately, that model does work, and it does improve the correlated variance. It does reduce the correlated variance, just not as well. Okay, and so here is kind of the full procedure that we do. So we acquire this DES and Gaia information for the bright stars in every exposure, and we calculate the residual field, and then we clip the outliers. We calculate the two-dimensional 2-point correlation function of the residual field, and we fit our von Karman model to Xi raw, where Xi raw is the two-dimensional 2-point correlation function of the raw data. And by raw, I just mean, the untouched. Well, it's not untouched, right? There's lots of pre-processing, but this is the data before any model gets to it. And we fit a simple chi-squared loss function to our von Karman model for this two-dimensional 2-point correlation function, and then we execute the GP once. So we actually calculate the residuals, and we click the outliers in these residuals again to remove any extraneous data. And then finally, using those parameters that we calculated in this initial chi-squared fit, which is computationally very fast. We run this optimizer on the Gaussian process regression algorithm, which again is essentially just linear algebra matrix inversion. It's like 2 lines of code. We minimize the output of Xi residuals for x less than 0.5 arc minutes. So what I'm saying here specifically is that we're minimizing the correlation function, but we're only looking at the correlation function for star separation of less than 0.5 arc minutes. And this is an arbitrary value that we chose based off of what it, to have enough points for this to be a stable metric of the data, but also not too many points such that we're no longer looking at just the correlation function of the zero. So, all right, let me take a step back. We're trying to estimate here the 0-point correlation function. So what is the correlation at 0 delay or 0 separation? And so we approximate that by saying, okay, we're looking at separations less than 0.5 arc minutes. Okay, and we have a validation set to do this. And as I said before, this is very slow. It requires 50 to 100 evaluations of the Gaussian process. It's miserable. We performed our analysis on about, I want to say 300 exposures. So that took, however long that took. It was a long time. Okay, and so now we can finally talk about some results here. So what I'm showing on the left is the same plot from before. That's a question?
Yeah, I just want a question on the last page. I mean,
yeah.
How bad is the model if you don't do the optimization step? If you just take the initial chi-squared fit, which is fast, like how sensitive are we really to the kernel and your optimization of the kernel?
Yeah, so that's really good. So this is exactly what that graph shows. So on the left here, we have the 2-dimensional 2-point correlation function. And then on the right, this is the angle averaged 2-dimensional 2-point correlation function, or just the angle average 2-point correlation function. The red curve here is showing what is the correlation at various pair separations as you go from about, what is this, 0.01 degrees of separation, and then all the way out to about a degree. And so the red curve, this is what the correlation function initially looks like. You might be able to convince yourself that it is somehow this, this red curve is somehow the angle, averaged of this plot down in the top left. The green shows what is the angle averaged 2-point correlation function of just that chi-squared fit. And so it's actually really quite good. So we're able to reduce the 0-point correlation from, what is that, about 120 milliarc seconds squared down to about 25. So we get about a factor of 5 in the reduction of variance, which is fantastic. We also are able to reduce the correlation length, which is, we define it as the angular separation at which the correlated variance drops by half. So we're at 120 here, and down here we're at about 60. And so for the original data, that's 5.7 arc minutes. And for the von Karman fit, we get down to 1.3 arc minutes. And this is, as it says above here, this is an average of about 300 exposures that aren't necessarily, they're all in a similar region of the sky, but they're not necessarily, they weren't picked for any particular reason. And then finally in the blue here, in this bottom curve, this is the full, the final result of the model. We get down to about, 10 milliarc seconds squared. So we do reduce the correlated variance quite a bit further when we do the final GPR optimization. But
is that
for
test or train?
This will be on the validation set or the testing set. So sorry, so we call the testing set the leftover 90,000 points that you would eventually actually deploy this model on. But the validation set, this is a we do some cross validation here on the validation set, and this is how we get these results. Okay, so this is quite interesting. We're quite happy about this, of course, that we're able to reduce correlated variance so much. And so let me show you some more results. So this is quite a complicated plot. What this is showing here, each point is a different exposure, and the shape and color of the point represents which band of exposure this is in. So if you're not familiar with bands, what a band or a pass band is we put a filter, a color filter, in front of the camera in order to take pictures in only a narrow band of wavelengths. And it's because we expect things to look different for various reasons. You could take an astronomy course about various reasons things will look different in different filters. So we have different filters here, and they all going to behave a little bit differently. What I'm showing here is the average reduction of this 0-point correlation function in each band. Okay, and so along this dotted black line over here, this is the no change line. So if an exposure lies along this line, then we know the model didn't change the correlated variance at all. If it's above that line, it made it worse. And you can see that's the case for one image here, although the error bars are rather large. And then finally, we have the 5 times reduction line, the 10 times reduction, and the 20 times reduction. You can see the average reduction is about 11 or 12 in each of the bands. If you're familiar with the dark energy survey, you might be thinking, what about the U band? What about the G band? We didn't think about the U band at all, first of all. And we didn't think about the G band. Well, we did think about the G band, but it turns out when we apply this method to G band exposures, which for those who don't know, in principle, we don't expect to be any different to the rest of these, really. When we apply this method to the G-band exposures, we find that it almost universally is either makes the correlated variance worse, or it lies in this region here between no change and a 5 times reduction. We're not sure why this happens at all. We kind of leave that to someone else in the DES collaboration to figure out what's wrong with the G-band. But anyway, what this plot is trying to show you here is that for the most part, we have lots of exposures with low amounts of, or high amounts of reduction in variance, which we're quite pleased with. And here is another image showing the same plot, but rather than the variance, we're showing the RMS error. So essentially the square root of that. And you can see there's that point here that this model made things worse. And we also have a color here, which is showing the stellar density. So this is going to essentially be the stellar density of the Gaia field. And because, right, so I told you before that there's about 100,000 stars or objects in a typical DES exposure, but in the Gaia exposure, there's going to be much fewer. And so the limit on the stellar density in any one of these exposures for the training set is going to be set by the stellar density in the Gaia field. You might be able to see that there's this group of stars in red here. I apologize for using a non-colorblind compliant palette, by the way. But anyway, this group of stars here that are all in red, this was a group of exposures that we looked at specifically because we wanted to see how well these new astrometric measurements performed by using them to fit an orbit to a trans-Neptunian object called Eris. So this is an object, a trans-Neptunian object, which is floating right orbiting out in the region of Neptune. And what we did is we took measurements of this. We applied our Gaussian process regression model to exposures where Eris was present in the exposure. And subtracting the residuals, subtracting the turbulence field from those exposures, we're able to try to improve what those measurements on Eris are. And what we can do is we can say, okay, well, what was the average RMS error on the Eris measurements before? It turns out it was about 10 milliarc seconds. And what we're able to do is we're able to reduce that to about 5 milliarc seconds. So what this is showing here, this is saying a stringent test, calculate residuals to a trans-Neptunian object orbit fit as it moves a few degrees across the sky over about 5 years. And it's not too bright, so shot noise is not negligible. And so what we're seeing here is that at each of these at each of these exposures, which is represented, on the x-axis, so this is each an observation of Eris across about 5 years. We can see the RA and DEC components, or the, alternatively, the X and the Y components of the measurement here. We're able to reduce that to about 5 milliarc seconds from down to about 10. And so what this is trying to show you is that this Gaussian process regression technique actually has some use. We can actually use this to make better orbit fittings for trans-Neptunian objects, or more importantly, which is kind of the main goal, I suppose, of this research, is to say, okay, well, now that we have a better astrometric catalog of these stars, now we can create a better proper motion catalog for all the stars in our survey, right? So now we can fit better proper motion to all of these stars that we have better astrometry for. And so I believe that they decided they're not going to do this with DES, but people are looking into this for the Reuben Observatory when that starts taking in data. And so finally, that's basically it. The key takeaways, the key science takeaways, are that we're able to reduce this turbulence-induced variance from about 7 milliarc seconds down to 2 across these 300 exposures. We're able to reduce our correlation length from 5.7 arc minutes to 1.2. We can fit an orbit to Eris and demonstrate that this model actually has some use by reducing the errors on the orbit fit to about 5 milliarc seconds, cutting it in about half. And finally, there are a few rooms for improvement. The first one is that, this same method can be deployed on the LSST survey, right? For the Reuben survey. The Reuben's exposure times are going to be shorter. So that means that the turbulence is going to average out less than it does in the DES survey. However, the astrometry is going to be better in other ways. So we kind of expect these things to cancel out and perhaps get similar performance with this model for the Reuben Observatory. And finally, what I hinted at before is that we can hopefully use this model to get a simultaneous solution for both the turbulence field, which we're solving for here, and also the proper motion field. So the idea is that we would input a series of consecutive exposures for a couple stars and say, okay, we can see that these stars are moving. So normally we could just fit a proper motion to them, but we can also fit the turbulence at the same time. And so hopefully this would not only speed things up for calculating the turbulence field and the proper motions, but hopefully that would give better measurements for both, in putting multiple exposures at once, providing more information for the model. And then finally, as we can see in the images of the 2-point correlation function, this von Karman model, this von Karman kernel that we've chosen is not necessarily optimal. And if someone wanted to pursue this and make this the best really that it can be, that would be somewhere to start for sure, finding a more optimal model. I can tell you a little bit, that particularly like the parameters that we've chosen, you would think that the fully optimized solution would contain parameters like the outer scale and the diameter. They would be reasonable, they would be physical, but they don't really seem to be. And so that's another clue that's telling us that this model that we've chosen is not necessarily optimal. But anyway, thank you very much for listening and for the opportunity for me to give you this talk today. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Willow. This was very interesting. I can see why all the judges of the in the contest like this work so much. It's very impressive. So
thank you very much.
Any questions? We lost a bunch of people at 1:30, which is, I guess, unavoidable on an online meeting. But if there are any questions, now is the time to ask. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'll ask another one. So, I mean, you're talking about application to LSST while also talking about how hard it is to scale this to even the full DES survey. So LSST is going to be exponentially worse. So do you have some comment about how to actually manage the computational costs to apply this to a large scale survey like LSST?
Yeah, so there's a few things that we can do. The first thing is to write this to be, well, the first thing is to put this on a high performance computing cluster, purchase 100 cores and have one exposure done, you know, I don't know, in a minute or whatever, how long it takes, and just have this run every year or whenever the collaboration wants to run it, have it run for a couple months, release the data, and be done with it. Alternatively, all of this code is simple linear algebra and translates very well to being written for GPUs. That's not a skill that I have, and that wasn't really something that I had time to learn. This could enormously benefit for this. A really cheap way to improve the computational time would be waiting for the Python, this is all written in Python, by the way, waiting for the Python module of Numba, which, if you're not familiar, is a just-in-time compiler. It compiles your Python code in C and runs things potentially 1,000 times faster. Waiting for Numba to support the methods that we used in this work, and it would run a whole lot faster there too.
So can you give an order of magnitude estimate for running on the whole DES survey? How many hundreds of thousands or how many thousands of core hours it would be?
It'd be quite a lot, yeah. Let's see. So there's 80,000 exposures. It takes, I'm going to say, 2 hours per exposure. That's 160,000 hours. We were running it on 12 cores, so that's almost 2 million core hours.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? I have one. Well, it's more of a, I don't know if it's a comment. I think their assumption of curl-free distortions, I think it sort of leads back to the first comment that I had about PSF behavior across the field. I think forcing it to be curl-free is a strong assumption that the telescope itself or the optical system is not contributing to any of these distortions. Right?
Right.
It's more of a
yeah. No, that makes sense. One of the reasons that we eventually use this curl-free is because we tested out various methods. So we tested out the anisotropic kernel where there's a different model for each the X and the Y. We did it for the curl-free, and we did a few, one or two other small changes. And we found that using the curl-free kernel actually gave a drastic reduction compared to the other methods. I don't certainly disagree with you that saying that this is curl-free is not perfectly motivated, but it certainly seems to be supported in the results.
Okay. Any other questions?
I had a couple of questions.
Oh, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah. This is really interesting. Can you go to one of the slides where you had those green arrows, all those green vectors of all the offsets?
Yeah.
Yeah, something like this. So the head of one of these arrows is a Gaia star, and the tail is a DES star, and they're supposed to be the same star. Yeah. How do you know that they're the same star? Like, if you have 10,000 stars here, if the separation between stars is less than the size of these green arrows, how do you know that you've cross-matched the stars correctly?
Yeah, so this problem actually turns out to be somewhat of a non-issue. So the first thing to note is that these arrows, the scale of these arrows is really blown up. So this across this whole focal plane is 2 degrees, but these arrows are scaled to this scaling. So that's 50 milliarcseconds, which is a million times smaller approximately than the size of this. So there's not a lot. And it turns out that when you actually do it, I don't super remember because I did, this is the very first step, but when you actually plot it, plot the 2 catalogs on top of each other, the separations between them is in the, in the micro arcsecond range. So it's not a huge problem. So that would be 1,000 times smaller than the errors that we're seeing here.
Okay. And I was also wondering, you had the picture of Jupiter and the blurry version and the sharp version. like you have this Gaussian process which tells you how to like correct the positions of individual stars, but can you also use, like once you have that Gaussian process, could you also take that blurry image of Jupiter and get the sharp version?
I
suspect.
think,
Go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say, I suspect that it could do something, but not really, because what we're predicting here has nothing to do with the actual amount of flux that we're measuring. We're just measuring the positions. So, I mean, in principle, we could ask it to predict the residuals for every single pixel and see what we get out, but I'm not entirely sure what that would look like. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say that the typical correlation scale in your solutions, or you said 10 arc minutes, right?
Yeah.
So if you happen to have a star field around Jupiter, in principle, you could just sort of find the solution around it and apply it over the Jupiter image, and that could solve it. Jupiter is much smaller than 10 arc minutes.
Right.
It might work that way, but it's got to be an approximate solution.
Right.
But there's lots of like galaxy images and stuff that I'm sure DES would like to sharpen up if they could with this method.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't even think about that actually. Yeah.
I had one other question. I don't know, does anybody else have a question?
I guess not. So go ahead, Alex.
Maybe this question doesn't even make sense. But with the optimizing the GP part, as I understood it, you were like optimizing it to try to minimize the correlations between like how much the error in the star position at different points. And I could see that if you are correcting the position exactly, like moving the star exactly back to the right, its true location, then that should eliminate those correlations entirely. But is it true the other way around? Like you're telling the machine learning thing, minimize these correlations. Is that equivalent to telling it to like figuring out the correct position of the stars? Is it possible that it might minimize those correlations, but not actually move the stars to the right places?
So that's possible if there are other sources of correlated error. But we believe that we've removed all of the correlated errors, all of the systematic effects. The one thing, though, of course, is that there are uncorrelated errors in this data set, which comes from finding the centroid. So when you actually take a picture of a point source, it's not actually, it doesn't all fall on one single pixel. It has this thing called a point spread function. And so finding the centroid of that point spread function incurs some shot noise errors. And so those are uncorrelated. And so you're right, we're not actually finding the true positions. What we're doing is we're minimizing this correlated variance. And we believe that the correlated variance is only seeded by the atmospheric turbulence. And so if we minimize this, we say, okay, that is removing the atmospheric turbulence. Now, your question was kind of saying like, is it possible that there's like a degenerate solution where removing this correlated variance does something entirely different? I don't think I know enough of the theory. I don't think I know the theory well enough to give you a definitive answer, but I want to say, no, there isn't a solution like that. And certainly we've never seen that. A solution that looks really bad, even though the correlated variance has been reduced a lot.
Because I know sometimes with these machine learning things, like all it knows is it's just trying to optimize whatever loss function you give it, but sometimes it does that in some clever way, which does something that you don't want it to do.
Right, and I suppose that could be. Yeah, that could be going on with the G-band that I was talking about, where we have no idea why it's making G-band worse, why the G-band is so weird. It's certainly possible that there could be a systematic in the data of the G-band that is making the optimizer behave weirdly. We don't know. Yeah.
Can I pile on with that for a question? So, you have 300 exposures here. How many of them have repeat measurements of stars? Did you engineer those 300 to have overlap? And can you see what the actual scatter and repeat measurements is in the astrometric positions?
So these are coad measurements. So this will be this astrometric catalog, each measurement of the star is some sort of average from the 6 years observation of that one star.
So you're looking at coads before you're doing your process rather than after? So this isn't a single exposure?
So this is a single exposure of coads.
Okay, well, that's not a single. So you can either have single exposures or have the coads, but you're taking the average of a bunch of different images of the exact same field, and then you're running your Gaussian process regression. Because you could do it the other way. You could have a single image that was a 30-second exposure. You could run your method on it, and you could have 6 that are on the exact same field, and you can compare what the actual variance of the output of your model is on those 6.
Right.
So you're not able to do that because you're only operating on coads. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. Now now that you've asked that question, I'm not so sure. Of course, it's been a year and a half since I've actually done this. I think we're working on coads, but at any rate, we didn't look into the question that you asked.
Well, it just might be interesting because it's a different metric that isn't just the loss factor that you've written down, but it's another good measurement, right? What the scatter would be from repeat measurements.
Right.
Okay, any other questions? Going once, going twice, and sold. So thank you again, Willow. Let me stop recording now. So.
Yeah.